On a sold-out flight from Atlanta to Orlando, 30,000 feet in the air, the world shrinks to a pressurized metal tube. For most, it's a few hours of mild discomfort. For Dr. Sarah Jenkins and her 8-year-old son Leo, it was supposed to be the magical start to a dream vacation. But for another passenger, a man named Richard Peterson, it was an inconvenience. He saw a child's innocent excitement not as a joy, but as an annoyance. He saw a polite request not as courtesy, but as an insult. And in a moment of shocking cruelty, he would use a cup of scalding coffee to make his point. What he didn't know was that he wasn't just scalding a child, he was lighting a fuse. And the woman who came to put it out, senior flight attendant Clara Jensen, wasn't just there to serve drinks. She was there to enforce the rules, and she was about to show him who was truly in command of that airplane. The air inside Flight 1421 to Orlando was thick with the usual cocktail of recycled oxygen, jet fuel, and human anticipation. It was a full flight, a Tuesday morning in late April, and the cabin buzzed with the energy of families heading for theme parks and business travelers trying to squeeze in one last conference call before takeoff. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a pediatric resident with eyes that held both the exhaustion of her profession and the fierce love of a mother, gently buckled her son into seat 15B. 8-year-old Leo Jenkins was practically vibrating with excitement. His small hands clutched a detailed book about the Kennedy Space Center, its cover adorned with a majestic picture of the Saturn V rocket. This trip was a promise, fulfilled a reward for his straight A's, and a much-needed escape for them both after a grueling year. "Mum, do you think we'll see a real rocket launch?" Leo whispered, his voice, a high-pitched note of pure awe. His brown eyes, wide and curious, scanned every corner of the aircraft. Sarah smiled, tucking a stray curl behind his ear. "Maybe not a launch, sweetie, but we'll see the real launch pads and the actual space shuttle Atlantis, just like in your book." Her world for that week was to be Leo's joy. She had saved for months, trading extra shifts for this one precious slice of time where she wasn't Dr. Jenkins but just Mom. The fragile peace of their little world in row 15 was shattered by the arrival of the man who would occupy seat 15C. His name, as his gold monogrammed briefcase would later attest, was Richard "Rick" Peterson. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit that was expensive, but ill-fitting, straining slightly at the shoulders and waist. He carried with him an aura of aggressive self-importance, sighing dramatically as he tried to jam an oversized carry-on into the already full overhead bin. "Unbelievable," he muttered loud enough for everyone in the surrounding rows to hear. "You'd think people would learn how to pack. It's not rocket science." He shot a pointed glare at a young woman who had placed a small backpack in the bin. He finally shoved his bag in with a grunt, then slumped into his seat, immediately pulling out his phone. "Janet, it's me!" He barked into the phone, forgoing any pretense of an indoor voice. "Yeah, I'm on the plane. No, it's a zoo. Full of tourists and screaming kids. The absolute dregs." He cast a sideways glance at Leo, who was quietly flipping through his book. Sarah felt a prickle of annoyance and instinctively put a protective arm on Leo's shoulder. The pre-flight announcements began, but Rick paid them no mind. His conversation continued a litany of complaints about his company, his ex-wife, and the incompetence of the world at large. He was, in short, the passenger. Every traveler dreads a black hole of negativity, sucking the pleasantness from the air around him. Sarah tried to ignore him, focusing on Leo. She pointed out the wing flaps and explained the basics of lift, turning the mechanical process into a story of adventure. Leo was enthralled, his attention thankfully diverted from the boorish man beside them. As the plane taxied to the runway, a flight attendant finally had to come and pointedly ask Rick to end his call. He rolled his eyes, snapping his phone shut with a final aggrieved, "I have to go. The fun police are here." The engines roared to life, and the plane surged forward. For a moment, as they ascended into the brilliant blue sky, the tension in row 15 seemed to dissolve. Below them, Atlanta shrank into a map of itself, and ahead lay Florida sunshine and the promise of space exploration. It was a temporary reprieve. The conflict grounded in arrogance and prejudice had only just begun its own ascent. It was taxiing on a runway of resentment, about to reach a terrifying and irreversible velocity. Once they reached cruising altitude, the familiar rhythm of flight took over. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and the flight attendants began their service. Sarah, ever prepared, had packed healthy snacks for Leo, but he looked longingly at the cart as it rolled by. "Could I maybe have some ginger ale?" "Mum, please," he asked, his voice the epitome of politeness. "Of course, sweetie." When the cart reached their row, Sarah ordered a ginger ale for Leo and a black coffee for herself. Rick, without looking up from the financial reports he was now aggressively highlighting on his laptop, grunted, "Coffee, black, and make it hot." The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Maria, smiled warmly. "Certainly, sir." Leo, careful not to disturb the man next to him, had his tray table down and was meticulously drawing a multi-stage rocket in his notebook. He was in his own little universe, a world of thrusters and escape velocities. He took a sip of his ginger ale, the bubbles fizzing on his tongue, and let out a tiny, happy sigh. It was this small sound of contentment that seemed to agitate Rick. He shifted in his seat, his knee bumping the back of the seat in front of him, eliciting a brief look from its occupant. He muttered something under his breath about annoying kids. About 20 minutes later, Leo needed to use the restroom. "Excuse me," Sarah said to Rick, her voice calm and courteous. "We just need to slip out for a moment." Rick didn't move. He continued staring at his laptop, his jaw tight. "Sir, excuse me," Sarah repeated, a little more firmly. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. He just sat down. "Can't he hold it? Some of us are trying to work here." "He's 8, Sarah said, her own patience beginning to fray. "And he's been very patient. We'll be quick." With a theatrical long-suffering sigh, Rick slammed his laptop shut and made a great show of maneuvering himself out of the way, his body language screaming that he was being subjected to the greatest inconvenience known to man. Sarah and Leo quickly slipped past and made their way to the lavatory. When they returned, Rick was already back in his seat, his laptop open, his coffee, sitting precariously on his tray table near the aisle. As Leo carefully shuffled past him to get to the window seat, the plane hit a minor pocket of turbulence, a gentle, almost unnoticeable shudder. But for Leo, who was concentrating on not touching the grumpy man, it was enough to make him lose his footing for a split second. His small hand, reaching out to steady himself, brushed against the back of Rick's seat. It was the lightest of touches, a ghost of a contact. But for Rick Peterson, it was an act of war. "Watch it, kid." He snapped, his voice a low growl. Leo froze, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry, sir." "Sorry doesn't cut it." Rick seethed, turning in his seat to face Sarah, who was still standing in the aisle. "Can't you control your child?" "This is exactly the problem. People let their kids run wild on these flights with no regard for anyone else." "It was an accident," Sarah said, her voice steady, but her heart beginning to pound. "The plane just shook a little. He barely touched your seat." "Barely touched it." Rick's voice rose, attracting the attention of passengers in the surrounding rows. "He's been fidgeting and whispering this whole flight. I paid for a full fare ticket, not a seat in the middle of a daycare center. You people need to learn some discipline." The phrase "you people" hung in the air, thick and ugly. It was a small two-word grenade, and Sarah felt its shrapnel instantly. Her skin prickled. This wasn't just about a bumped seat anymore. "We have been nothing but quiet and respectful," she said, her voice dropping to a steely calm. "My son has been bothering no one. I suggest you lower your voice and stop trying to intimidate a child." Rick let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Intimidate? Oh, I'm just getting started. Maybe if you spent less time coddling him and more time teaching him manners, we wouldn't be having this conversation." He turned his back on her, then a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He picked up his coffee cup, his knuckles white. The tremor of turbulence had passed, but a far more dangerous turbulence was brewing in seat 15C. And it was about to make a devastating impact. The confrontation had left a toxic residue in the air. Passengers in rows 14 and 16 were now pointedly not looking, yet every ear was tuned to the drama unfolding in row 15. Leo was silent, his face pale. The joy had been leached from his expression, replaced by a fear and confusion that broke his mother's heart. He had apologized, yet the man was still angry. He didn't understand. Sarah settled back into her seat, her body a rigid wall between her son and the man. She put a reassuring arm around Leo, pulling him close. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "That man is just having a very bad day. It has nothing to do with you." Rick scoffed loud enough for them to hear. "Bad day," he mimicked in a derisive whisper. The next few minutes passed in a thick, tense silence. Sarah could feel the heat radiating from Rick, the heat of his anger, his indignation, his prejudice. He was stewing, and she knew with a dreadful certainty that it wasn't over. He was a man who needed to have the last word to assert his dominance. He signaled the flight attendant, Maria, who had served them earlier. "Another coffee," he demanded, holding up his empty cup. "And make sure it's fresh this time. The last one was lukewarm." Maria, ever the professional, simply nodded. "Right away, sir." She returned moments later with a steaming paper cup. "Please be careful, sir, it's very hot," she warned, placing it on his tray table. Rick took a loud, performative sip. "Finally," he said, setting the cup down again, positioning it deliberately near the edge of his table, closer to Sarah's side. Sarah saw it. It was a small thing, but in the context of the preceding hostility, it felt like the placement of a landmine. She considered saying something, asking him to move it, but she didn't want to engage him again, to give him another excuse to berate her and her son. She chose what she thought was the path of de-escalation silence. It was a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Then it happened. It was a fluid, deliberate motion, disguised as a clumsy accident. Rick reached for his laptop, his elbow swinging out and back, connecting squarely with the base of the coffee cup. Time seemed to slow down. The cup didn't just tip, it launched. A brown arc of searing liquid flew through the air directly onto the small boy in seat 15A. Leo screamed. It wasn't a cry of surprise, but a raw, piercing shriek of pure agony. The coffee, far from lukewarm, had soaked through his t-shirt and onto the sensitive skin of his arm and lap in an instant. "Oh my God!" Sarah yelled, her mind scrambling to catch up with the horror. She unbuckled her seatbelt in a frenzy, fumbling to unbuckle Leo's. The smell of burnt coffee filled the air, acrid and sickening. Rick, meanwhile, was the picture of feigned shock. "Oh goodness, I am so terribly clumsy," he exclaimed, his voice dripping with a false sincerity that was more insulting than the act itself. "So sorry about that. It was an accident." He made a weak, pathetic attempt to dab at the spill with a tiny cocktail napkin. But Sarah wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her son. Leo was sobbing, trying to pull the hot, wet fabric of his shirt away from his skin, which was already turning an alarming shade of red. "Get up, Leo, get up!" she urged, pulling him out of his seat and into the aisle. Passengers gasped. A woman in front of them turned around her face, a mask of horror. A man across the aisle, a businessman named Mark, was already on his feet. "What the hell did you do?" Mark demanded, his voice booming through the cabin as he pointed at Rick. Rick held up his hands in mock surrender. "It was an accident. The kid was fidgeting. I moved my arm. These things happen." But Sarah had seen it. She had seen the flicker of intent in his eyes just before his elbow moved. She had seen the smug satisfaction that flashed across his face for a microsecond before he arranged it into a mask of concern. This was no accident. This was an assault. "Help!" Sarah cried out, her voice cracking with panic and fury. "Somebody help me! My son is burned!" And from the galley at the front of the plane, help was already on its way. But it wasn't the kind of help Richard Peterson was expecting. It was senior flight attendant Clara Jensen, and she was about to show him that on her aircraft there were consequences for every action. If Maria was the warm, welcoming face of the airline senior flight attendant, Clara Jensen was its steel spine. A woman in her early 50s, with neatly pinned silver blonde hair and a gaze that could freeze jet fuel, Clara had been flying for 28 years. She had dealt with everything from medical emergencies over the Atlantic to fistfights in the aisle over reclining seats. She moved with an economy of motion and a palpable aura of authority that came from decades of managing chaos in a confined space. When she heard Leo's scream, she was in the forward galley preparing for the next service. She didn't run. She moved. Her walk down the aisle was brisk, purposeful, and commanding. The parting of passengers was like the Red Sea before Moses. Her first priority, her only priority in that moment, was the child. She ignored Rick completely, her eyes locking onto Sarah and the crying, trembling Leo. "Ma'am, I'm Clara, the purser. Let's get him to the galley right now," she said, her voice a calm, anchoring force in the sea of panic. "We have a first aid kit and burn supplies." She gently guided Sarah and Leo towards the front of the plane, her body language shielding them from the prying eyes of the other passengers. Once in the relative privacy of the galley, she worked with a practiced efficiency that was nothing short of astonishing. "Take his shirt off gently," she instructed Sarah. "Let's see the damage." Sarah, her hands shaking, did as she was told. The skin on Leo's left arm and a patch on his thigh were red and blistering. Leo flinched and cried as the cool air hit the burns. Clara was already at work. She pulled out a sterile burn kit, cool compresses, and specialized burn gel. She didn't coo or offer empty platitudes. She spoke to Leo directly, with respect. "Leo, my name is Clara. I know this hurts a lot, but I'm going to put something on it that will make it feel much cooler. Can you be brave for me for one more minute?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. Leo, seeing her calm confidence, managed a small, tearful nod. As Clara expertly applied the cool compresses and the soothing gel, Sarah felt her own panic begin to subside, replaced by a wave of profound gratitude. Only when Leo was treated, wrapped in a blanket, and sipping on some cool water, did Clara turn her attention to the next part of her job. Her expression, which had been one of focused compassion, shifted subtly. The steel returned to her eyes. "Sarah," she said, addressing her by her first name, which she'd glanced from the passenger manifest. "I need to go back and speak with the other passenger. I will need a statement from you, but only when you're ready. My colleague will stay here with you and Leo." Sarah nodded, clutching her son. "He did it on purpose," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He was angry with us, and he did it on purpose." Clara's face remained impassive, but a flicker in her eyes, acknowledged Sarah's words. "I will handle it," she said. And with that simple promise, she turned and walked back down the aisle to row 15. Rick Peterson was sitting back in his seat, affecting an air of detached annoyance, as if the entire incident had been a tedious interruption to his important work. The man across the aisle. Mark was still standing, his arms crossed, glaring at Rick. Clara stopped beside Rick's seat. She didn't lean down to his level. She stood tall, forcing him to crane his neck to look up at her. "Sir," she began, her voice devoid of any emotion. "I am Clara Jensen, the purser on this flight. I need you to gather your personal belongings." Rick looked confused. "What for? I'm not moving. It was an accident." "I did not ask if it was an accident." Clara stated her tone flat and non-negotiable. "I am instructing you to gather your belongings. You are being relocated to another seat. Now." Rick's arrogance flared. "I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to my assigned seat. I'm a Platinum Medallion member, for God's sake. Do you know who I am?" This Clara had heard 1,000 times. It was the last resort of the entitled. Her response was immediate and crushing. "Right now, sir, you are passenger 15C on my manifest. You are also the individual involved in an incident that has resulted in injury to a minor. Your frequent flyer status is irrelevant. The Federal Aviation Administration regulations under which this aircraft operates give the flight crew final authority on all matters of safety and security. This is now a matter of safety. So I will say this one more time: take your laptop, your briefcase, and your jacket, and follow me." Her voice had not risen a single decibel, yet it carried the absolute weight of law. Every word was a perfectly placed stone, building a wall of authority that Rick could not breach. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, looking for a crack in her resolve. He found none. Other passengers were watching their faces, a mixture of shock and dawning respect. The man Mark gave a slight nod of approval. Defeated for the moment, Rick began to slowly, sullenly gather his things. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I'm going to file a complaint. I'm going to have your job." Clara didn't even blink. "That is your prerogative, sir. Once we land, you will be given all the necessary information to do so, after you speak with law enforcement." The color drained from Rick's face. "Law enforcement for an accident." "That will be for them to determine," Clara said, turning her back on him. "Follow me." She led him to the very back of the plane, to a single empty middle seat in the last row, right next to the lavatories. "You will remain in this seat with your seatbelt fastened until we have begun our final descent." "Do you understand?" Rick just glared at her, speechless. Clara wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that only he could hear. "You asked me if I knew who you were. Let me be clear about who I am. I am the person responsible for the safety of 180 souls on this plane, including the child you just burned. You created a disturbance, you injured a passenger, and you have lied about your actions. You are a liability, so for the remainder of this flight you will do exactly as you are told. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not cause any further trouble. This is no longer a customer service issue. This is a federal offense. You're not the boss here, Mr. Peterson. I am." She straightened up, her professional mask back in place, and walked away, leaving Richard Peterson stewing in the back of the plane, the smell of the lavatory, and his own festering fury his only companions. The battle was over, but the war for justice had just begun. With Richard Peterson effectively quarantined at the back of the aircraft, Clara Jensen's focus shifted from immediate crisis management to methodical documentation. She knew that what happened on the ground would be determined entirely by the quality and accuracy of the report she created in the air. She returned to the galley where another flight attendant was keeping a calm watch over Sarah and Leo. Leo had quieted down the pain medication from the advanced medical kit and the soothing gel taking effect. He was now fixated on a small toy plane the other attendant had given him. Clara knelt down to Sarah's level. "How is he doing?" "Better," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I can't thank you enough for how you've handled this." "It's my job to keep my passengers safe," Clara replied simply. "Now I need to ask you for some information, if you're up to it. I am required to file an in-flight incident report with the captain, which will be forwarded to the airline and the FAA. It's important that we get your account of what happened in your own words." Sarah took a deep, steadying breath and nodded. She recounted the entire event, starting with Rick's hostile behavior during boarding, his loud phone call, his aggressive reaction when she and Leo needed to use the restroom, and the specific, chilling detail of how he had moved his elbow to deliberately knock the coffee over. "He looked right at me before he did it," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she remembered the injustice. "There was this flash of satisfaction in his eyes. He wanted to hurt my son to get back at me." Clara listened without interruption, her pen flying across the official incident report form. She recorded dates, times, seat numbers, and verbatim quotes. Her questions were precise. "Did he use any specific language that you found threatening? Did he make physical contact with you or your son prior to the coffee incident? Were there any other passengers who may have witnessed this?" That was the crucial question. Sarah's story, while compelling, was still one person's word against another's. "Yes," Sarah said immediately. "The man across the aisle, in 15D. He saw the whole thing. He stood up and yelled at Mr. Peterson right after it happened." "Thank you. That's very helpful," Clara said. She then informed Sarah of the next steps. "I've already spoken with Captain Evans. He is aware of the situation. Given that an assault on a minor has been alleged, we will be requesting that law enforcement meet the aircraft at the gate in Orlando." Sarah felt a wave of relief, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. This wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. It was being taken seriously. Clara then moved on to her next task. She approached the man in 15D, whom she identified from her manifest as Mark Renshaw. He was in his 50s with a kind face that was currently set in a grim line. "Mr. Renshaw, I'm Clara Jensen, the purser," she said quietly. "I understand you may have witnessed the incident that just occurred." Mark nodded emphatically. "I saw the whole damn thing. That guy," he gestured with his head toward the back of the plane, "was a complete jackass from the moment he sat down. The way he spoke to that woman and her son was disgusting. And that coffee spill, no way was that an accident. He lined it up. It was a cheap shot, a deliberate act. I'm a physicist, I understand vectors and motion. His elbow moved backward in an unnatural way. It was intentional." Clara's professional demeanor didn't change, but inwardly she felt a sense of triumph, an articulate, credible witness, a physicist, no less. She took his statement, his contact information, and his offer to speak with police on the ground. She then discreetly spoke with two other passengers in the surrounding rows, a college student in 16C and an elderly woman in 14B. Both corroborated the story. They heard Rick's loud, aggressive language and saw the coffee fly in a way that didn't seem accidental. The student had even instinctively started recording on her phone right after Leo screamed. The footage was shaky, but it clearly captured Rick's insincere apology and Mark Renshaw's immediate angry reaction. With a folder full of damning statements and digital evidence, Clara made her way to the cockpit. She knocked and entered, closing the door behind her. Captain Evans, a veteran pilot with a calm and commanding presence, turned to her. "What's the full story, Clara, or—" She laid it out for him, and the first officer presenting the facts without emotion or speculation. She relayed Sarah's account, the corroborating statements from 3 other passengers, the existence of the video, and the nature of Leo's injuries. "He claims it was an accident," she concluded. "But based on the witness accounts and the passengers' prior hostile behavior, I believe the action was intentional, an act of aggression against a child. I've relocated the passenger to 32B and informed him that he is to remain there until we are on the ground." Captain Evans listened, his expression growing more and more serious. "The cockpit of an airplane is the captain's domain. He is the ultimate authority, and he does not take disturbances or assaults lightly." "You did the right thing, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't just a disruptive passenger. It's a potential assault. It's a security issue. Get on the horn to dispatch. Tell them we are declaring a Level 1 security threat due to a belligerent and potentially violent passenger. We need law enforcement and airline security to meet us at the gate. No delays, no excuses. They are to board the aircraft the moment the jet bridge is attached." "Yes, Captain," Clara said. "And Clara," he added, as she was about to leave. "Good work. You let that family know we've got their back." As she walked back to her station, Clara felt the gentle shift of the plane as it began its initial descent into Orlando. For most passengers, it signaled the end of their journey. But for Richard Peterson, who was still stewing in the last row, the descent was just beginning. He was heading for a landing much harder than he could ever have imagined. The final 30 minutes of the flight were a masterclass in controlled tension. The cabin was eerily quiet. The usual chatter and rustle of passengers preparing to land was replaced by a somber awareness that something significant had transpired. Everyone, it seemed, knew what was waiting on the ground. Everyone except Richard Peterson, who was still clinging to a sliver of delusional hope that his platinum medallion status and a strongly worded complaint would make this all go away. He saw this as a gross overreaction by a power-tripping flight attendant. He was the victim here, his work disrupted, his comfort compromised. Clara made sure Sarah and Leo were moved to the more spacious seats in the front bulkhead row for the landing, giving them privacy and easy access to deplane. She provided Sarah with a direct number to the airline's Special Services Department, assuring her they would be taken care of. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump on the Orlando runway, the familiar announcement came over the PA system. But this time, Clara added a special postscript. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened even after we have arrived at the gate, and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We have a situation that requires all passengers to remain on board until instructed otherwise. Thank you for your cooperation." A murmur went through the cabin. This was not standard procedure. The plane taxied to gate 42, and the engine spooled down into silence. The jet bridge, with its accordion-like tunnel, docked with the aircraft with a solid thud. The cabin door was opened, but instead of the usual flood of eager passengers, 3 figures stepped onto the plane, 2 uniformed officers from the Orlando International Airport Police Department, and a stern-looking airline security manager in a suit. One of the officers conferred quietly with Clara, who handed him her folder of reports and pointed discreetly towards the back of the plane. Then the officer's voice boomed through the quiet cabin. "Richard Peterson." Every head turned to look at the last row. Rick felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up his neck. This was a nightmare, a public spectacle. He slowly stood up. "I need you to come with us, sir," the officer said, his hand resting calmly on his belt. "This is insane," Rick sputtered as he shuffled down the aisle, grabbing his briefcase from the overhead bin. "I'm the one who should be pressing charges. My suit is stained." No one laughed. The other passengers stared at him with a uniform expression of cold contempt. As he walked past row 15, his former seat, he couldn't help but glance at it. Then his eyes met those of Mark Renshaw, the physicist from 15D. Mark just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust on his face. Rick was the first person escorted off the plane. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he was met with the mortifying sight of dozens of waiting passengers for the next flight, all staring at the man being led away by 2 police officers. His public humiliation was complete. Only after he was gone did Clara make another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. You may now deplane. For those with connecting flights, our ground staff will be available to assist you." As people began to file out, many of them stopped to quietly thank Clara or give Sarah a sympathetic look. Mark Renshaw paused beside Sarah and Leo. "I gave the purser and the police my statement and my business card," he said to her, his voice kind. "If you need a witness for anything at all, you call me. What he did was inexcusable. I hope your son is okay, and you can still enjoy your vacation." "Thank you," Sarah said, genuinely touched. "That means more than you know." The airline security manager personally escorted Sarah and Leo through the terminal to a private lounge. He apologized profusely on behalf of the airline. He informed them that their entire trip flight's hotel and park tickets would be fully refunded. Furthermore, they were being given a voucher for $5,000 for a future trip anywhere the airline flew. Their luggage would be collected and delivered directly to their hotel, and a private car was waiting to take them there. "Dr. Jenkins," the manager said, his tone sincere. "What happened on that flight is not what our airline stands for. Ms. Jensen is one of our finest, and she will be officially commended for her actions. We take the safety and well-being of our passengers, especially children, as our highest priority. Mr. Peterson will be permanently banned from flying with us ever again, pending the results of the police investigation." Sitting in the quiet lounge, watching Leo finally smile again as he ate an ice cream sundae brought by the staff, Sarah felt the tight knot of fury and fear in her chest finally begin to loosen. Justice, it seemed, was being served. But the wheels of karma were just getting started. Richard Peterson's immediate problem was the police, but his real reckoning was still to come. He had no idea that his actions on Flight 1421 had not just ruined a child's day. They had detonated a bomb in the heart of his professional life, and the fallout was going to be catastrophic. For Richard Peterson, the interrogation room at the Orlando International Airport Police substation was a special kind of hell. It was beige. The walls were beige. The floor was a scuffed beige linoleum, and the metal table bolted to the floor was a scratched and faded beige. The only color came from the harsh white-blue glare of the fluorescent lights overhead, which hummed with a maddening, incessant buzz. For a man who lived his life in a world of mahogany desks, plush carpets, and the reverential quiet of executive suites, this room was an assault on the senses. It was the color of insignificance. He sat for nearly an hour alone, his initial fury simmering down into a petulant stew of indignation. This was a farce, a gross overreaction. His lawyer, a pit bull named Alan, would have this sorted in an hour. He'd sue the airline, the flight attendant, probably even the mother for negligence. He mentally rehearsed his grievances, polishing them until they shone in his mind. Finally, a detective entered. He was older, with a weary face that suggested he'd seen every possible permutation of human stupidity. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat down opposite Rick and placed a thin manila folder on the table. He opened it, but didn't look at the papers inside. He looked at Rick. "So," the detective began, his voice a gravelly monotone. "You want to tell me how your accident resulted in second-degree burns on an 8-year-old boy?" Rick launched into his well-rehearsed speech. "It was turbulence," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "The plane shook. My arm moved. It's a cramped space, a complete accident. Frankly, I'm the victim here. My suit and Armani is ruined. I was verbally assaulted by another passenger, and that flight attendant." The detective held up a single, thick-knuckled hand. The gesture was so devoid of drama, yet so absolute in its authority, that Rick's words died in his throat. "Let's cut the crap. Shall we, Mr. Peterson?" the detective said, leaning forward slightly. "Let's talk about the facts. Fact 1. The flight data recorder for Flight 1421 shows no significant turbulence at the time of the incident. In fact, it was one of the smoothest segments of the flight. The pilot's report confirms this." He slid a paper from the folder. "A meteorological report. Fact 2. He continued, his eyes still locked on Rick's. "We have a statement from the passenger in 15D, a Mr. Mark Renshaw. He's a physicist. He has a PhD from MIT in applied mechanics. He gave us a very detailed, very scientific explanation of why your elbow couldn't have accidentally moved in the vector required to propel that cup in that specific direction. He described it as an unnatural, deliberate backward motion." "Do you want to argue physics with an MIT professor?" Rick's mouth was dry. He was belligerent. He has a grudge. Fact 3. The detective plowed on, ignoring him. "We have 2 other signed witness statements. One from a student in 16C and one from a retiree in 14B. Both state they heard you using aggressive and hostile language toward the mother and child immediately before the accident. Both state it didn't look like an accident to them." He slid 2 more papers across the table. The neatly printed statements seemed to mock Rick with their clarity. "And then there's this," the detective said, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen and a video began to play. It was shaky, but the audio was crystal clear. It was Rick's own voice, dripping with false sincerity. "Oh goodness, I am so terribly clumsy." Then Mark Renshaw's angry shout. "What the hell did you do?" The detective put the phone down. "The student who filmed this, a young woman named Chloe Vance, says you were staring at the mother with a smirk on your face right before you knocked the cup. She uploaded this video about an hour ago. It's already been viewed 400,000 times. The beige walls of the room seemed to be closing in on Richard Peterson. The hum of the lights grew louder. The foundation of his reality, a world where his status and his voice mattered, was cracking beneath him. His arrogance was a currency that held no value here. I want my lawyer," he stammered. "You should have asked for him an hour ago," the detective said, closing the folder. "Richard Peterson, you're being charged with assault in the 3rd degree and felony child endangerment. You can make your phone call from booking." While Rick was being fingerprinted, the digital wildfire was already raging out of control. Chloe Vance's tweet had been retweeted by a major news anchor. The hashtag #OysterCoffeeAssault was trending nationwide. On Reddit, in forums like Justice Served, users had cross-referenced the flight number with passenger social media posts and identified Richard Peterson of Viridian Dynamics in less time than it took to brew a pot of coffee. His corporate headshot was plastered everywhere, next to screenshots of his smirking face from the video. At the Atlanta headquarters of Viridian Dynamics, it was Armageddon. The switchboard had crashed. The junior social media manager, a 24-year-old, who was used to posting bland articles about market trends, was watching a tidal wave of hatred and disgust wash over every corporate platform. The firm's Yelp and Google ratings were plummeting in real time, bombarded with one-star reviews from people who had never been clients. CEO Charles Maxwell stood in the center of his cavernous office, a Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, ticking away the seconds of his company's public execution. With him were his heads of PR, HR, and his general counsel. "How bad is it, Janice?" Maxwell barked at his PR chief. "It's a complete catastrophe." "Charles," she said, not looking up from her tablet. "CNN and Fox News have both called. The Wall Street Journal is running an online story. The video is approaching 2 million views. They're calling him Quack a Coffee Rick. We're not just part of the story, we are the story. Our brand is being associated with child abuse." "He's a senior VP," Maxwell raged, pacing the room. "He's supposed to be a leader, an adult. What was he thinking?" "Based on his expense reports, thinking isn't his strong suit," the HR director muttered dryly before adding, "We need to cut him loose. Now, we need to cauterize the wound." "Unpaid leave effective immediately," Maxwell ordered. "Cut his email, his keycard, his corporate accounts, everything. And Janice draft a statement, appalled and horrified. Actions do not reflect our values. Zero tolerance for such behavior. You know the drill. Make it sound like we're as disgusted as everyone else." "We are," she said grimly. The general counsel, a man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "The termination might get sticky. He has a contract. He could sue." Maxwell spun around, his eyes blazing. Let him sue us. Let him stand up in a court and say he was wrongfully terminated for scalding a child on a plane while representing our firm. I'll pay for the popcorn. Fire him. And don't do it with a text message. I want him to hear it. I want him to know that he is poison, and we are purging him from the system." At 3:15 p.m., Charles Maxwell's private line, a phone that rarely rang, trilled to life. The caller ID was a name that made his breath catch Renshaw Innovations. It was the Golden Goose, the $250 million acquisition that would make their year their decade. It was the deal Rick Peterson was supposed to be finalizing. "Mark, good to hear from you," Maxwell said, forcing a jovial tone into his voice, waving for quiet from the others in the room. "I trust you're calling to dot the I's and cross the T's. We're ready on our end." The silence that greeted him was heavy and cold. When Mark Renshaw finally spoke, his voice was unrecognizable from the warm, collaborative tone of their previous calls. It was flat hard and utterly final. "Charles, I was on a flight yesterday. Flight 1421 from Atlanta to Orlando." The blood drained from Maxwell's face. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The three other executives froze, sensing the precipice upon which they now stood. "I was in seat 15D, Charles," Renshaw continued. "Your senior vice president of acquisitions, Richard Peterson, was in 15C. I didn't just read about the incident. I didn't just see the video. I was 3 feet away. I watched him berate a mother and her child who had done nothing wrong. I heard the racist undertones in his 'you people' comment. And I saw with my own 2 eyes the deliberate malicious act of him injuring that boy with a cup of hot coffee." Maxwell sank into his leather chair. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the entire skyscraper was tilting on its axis. "Mark, my God, I am speechless. That man, he's a rogue employee, a disgrace. We're terminating him as we speak. His actions are not Viridian dynamics." "Aren't they?" Renshaw's voice was sharp-cutting. "He holds a senior title, Charles. He manages a team. He makes decisions that affect your company's future. He was your company on that plane. The character of your company was sitting in seat 15C yesterday, and it was ugly, cruel, and pathetic. At Renshaw Innovations, we built our success not just on brilliant code, but on a culture of respect. We believe that how you do anything is how you do everything. A man who bullies a child over a bumped seat is a man who will bully a subordinate in a boardroom. A man who takes a shortcut to inflict pain is a man who will take a shortcut in a business deal. "Mark, please," Maxwell begged, his voice cracking. "This is a $250 million deal. We can't let the actions of one idiot destroy it. Think of the shareholders, the employees." "I am thinking of my employees," Renshaw shot back, "and I will not force them to partner with a company whose leadership at any level displays that kind of moral bankruptcy. The deal is dead, Charles. Consider this your official notification. My lawyers will send the paperwork. Find better ambassadors for your brand." The line went dead. For a full minute, Charles Maxwell just stared at the silent phone. The hum of the city outside his window seemed distant and muffled. Then he looked up at his team, his face a pale, taut mask of fury. The $250 million deal, the 7-figure bonus Rick Peterson was counting on, the future of their firm, all of it incinerated in a flash of hot coffee and petty rage. "Henderson," Maxwell said, his voice dangerously quiet, "when you call Peterson, I want you to make one thing very, very clear to him. He isn't just fired. He's the man who cost this company $250 million. I want him to understand that." The aftermath for Richard Peterson was a slow, agonizing descent. His lawyer managed to plead his felony child endangerment charge down to a misdemeanor, but it came at a price, a massive fine restitution to the Jenkins family, which Sarah quietly donated to a children's hospital burn unit, 200 hours of community service, and a year of court-mandated anger management therapy. His career was annihilated. The story was too public, the details too sordid. He was radioactive. His former colleagues and contacts stopped returning his calls. His name was a punchline in the financial world. He tried to get a job at a rival firm, and the hiring manager laughed at him. He was a pariah. The final personal blow came a week later. A call from his ex-wife, whom he hadn't spoken to in 2 years. He expected a lecture, perhaps even some smug satisfaction. He didn't expect the quiet sadness in her voice. "I saw the video, Rick," she said. And all I could think was, that's him. That's the man I divorced. The impatience, the contempt for anyone you think is beneath you, the little acts of cruelty you think no one notices. I'm just so sorry a little boy had to be the one to prove it to the world. He sat there in his silent, empty condo, the man who once commanded boardrooms, now reduced to a viral meme and a cautionary tale. He had lost his job, his reputation, his fortune, and the last vestiges of his dignity. All for a moment of power over a woman and a child who had dared to inconvenience him. Weeks later in Orlando, Leo Jenkins carefully pinned a small silver airplane pin to the corkboard in his room. It had arrived in a handwritten letter from a senior flight attendant named Clara. It was a pin for a brave co-pilot. For Leo, it wasn't a reminder of the scary man or the hot coffee. It was a reminder of the kind lady who made the pain go away, the nice man who stood up for him and his mum, who was always, always there to protect him. It was a small silver symbol of the simple truth that while cruelty may have its moment, courage and kindness have a way of flying higher and further than hate ever could. The story of Flight 1421 is a powerful reminder that the world, even at 30,000 feet, is a very small place. Richard Peterson thought he was anonymous, a man in a crowd who could act without consequence. But he was wrong. His cruelty was met with the unshakable professionalism of Clara Jensen, the quiet courage of Dr. Sarah Jenkins, and the moral clarity of witnesses like Mark Renshaw. This wasn't just about a spilled coffee. It was about the fundamental choice we all make every day to treat others with dignity or with contempt. Karma in this story wasn't some mystical force. It was the direct result of human action. It was the CEO who valued his company's reputation, the witnesses who chose to speak up, and the flight attendant who refused to back down. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We share stories like this every week, stories where justice prevails and where bullies learn that their actions have very real, very hard consequences. Thank you for listening.